All right, so I'm doing this webinar because I'm really committed to getting the word out about emotional healing. I think emotional healing is extremely critical, and I believe that emotional healing is really needed right now. And I was working on devising the program and getting the program to be adjusted so it could go out there, and it occurred to me that I needed to start telling the story about how this all came to be and what I learned about it, what I learned from doing it. I originally, when I first started doing emotional healing work, I actually shared these stories a lot, and I quit for three reasons. One, I stopped because people tended to, as I told these stories, they would tend to like make it all about me. I mean, like they would like think like, "Wow, you're so great" or whatever, and or people who thought the stories were kind of crazy, maybe thought I was a little bit crazy, which didn't bother me. What more bothered me is the people who wanted to put me on a pedestal, like I was some kind of special person for being able to do this. And that's not the way I saw this. I was trying to share how amazing this work was, not how amazing I am. And the second thing is a lot of people, when I tell these stories, a lot of these things are amazing spiritual experiences, and people can be very funny about that kind of thing because different people have different, religious background, religious training, and so sometimes maybe I'd say something that wasn't in keeping with their religious principles, and then they might shut me out, or their religious beliefs. And I didn't want to shut people out because I've worked with people of all different religious persuasions, and I've also worked with people who aren't religious or spiritually minded at all, and I've been able to help all of them. And I don't want anybody to miss out on this work because they think that I'm too Christian or too New Age or too whatever they decide that I am. And the work is about really helping people. And so the third reason is that at that time I was going through some difficult personal transitions to myself, and I'd just gotten divorced. I had a large amount of child support I was paying, and I didn't want to lose customers. I didn't want to offend anybody, so I kind of backed off and got politically correct. Well, anyway, I decided that if this work is to go forward, I really have to acknowledge the source of it because it wasn't me. It never has been about me. And so I'm going to tell the story. And I decided to be brave, and I realized that if somebody gets offended, maybe I'm just more mature now, if somebody gets offended and they don't like it, then that's okay. This message is for those people who this resonates with. So if what I talk about tonight resonates with you, then this message is for you. If it doesn't resonate with you, then do what I do when I hear something that doesn't resonate with me. Just set it aside. It's not that important. It won't change anything in terms of how I think about anybody if they disagree with me or don't see things the way I do. So that's just the beginning of getting kind of the background for this. So before I tell the story about how I did emotional healing, it's necessary to understand a little bit about me in order to be able to understand the story. And I want to tell you about an experience I had when I was 20 years old, where I decided to surrender my life to God. I had just gone through a very humiliating personal experience, and I felt very low, very small. And what I wanted more than anything else is to get right with God and align myself with God, because I felt like I was so stupid and made so many dumb mistakes. And so I had been praying rather earnestly about trying to develop a relation with God for a couple of weeks. And then when this humiliating experience happened, I really went out and I completely surrendered. I said, God, I will do anything you want me to do. I will give up anything you want me to give up. And I listed a bunch of things that I would be willing to give up to know God. I said, but I need to know for myself that what I'm doing is what you want me to do, not what somebody tells me you want to do or what I believe because of something I've been taught. I need to know for myself and have a relationship with you. And I heard a voice. Wasn't an audible voice. It was an internal voice, but it was definitely a voice that was speaking to me, and it said, "Stephen, thy sins are forgiven thee. Walk humbly, diligently, and prayerfully before me, and thou shalt be blessed." And I actually carried on a conversation. Don't remember what I talked about, but I carried on a conversation with that voice, which I call Spirit, for about 10 or 15 minutes, and got a lot of personal instruction that I've forgotten because it was pertinent to what was going on in my life at the time. But ever since that time, I have been able to pray and get answers. And so when I talk about listening to the Spirit, I'm talking about listening to the still small voice that speaks inside when you really connect with God. And that's basically how I learned to do this work. And as I started to listen to that voice, I had a lot of very, very beautiful experiences, even before I started doing emotional healing work. So one of my experiences that I've actually produced a short YouTube video about was when I was going to college, and I was on my way home from campus one evening, and that little spiritual voice said, "Go visit these people I knew," and I stopped by their apartment, and somebody was there who was asking them some very difficult spiritual questions that they didn't know how to answer, and I was able to help answer this person's questions, and then this person left, and my friends who were there said, "Oh, we're so glad you came by. We were just hoping, we needed help. We were praying for help, and then you showed up." And that was great. I thought that was really a wonderful experience. I'd already had experiences like that before. But what was interesting is no sooner had I left that person's apartment and was headed back to my apartment complex when this little voice said again, "Go visit Yvette Walrath." And Yvette lived in the same apartment complex that I did, and in the school I was going to, which was sponsored by the church I belonged to at that time, you had a curfew. You weren't supposed to visit apartments of the opposite sex after 10 o'clock at night, and it was 10:15, and I said, "I can't do that. It's against the rules." And the little voice inside said, "I don't care. Go visit Yvette Walrath." So I thought, okay, I'm going to walk by her apartment and see if the light is on, and if the light's on, I'll knock on the door. And so the light was on. I knocked on the door, and Yvette answered the door, and she was in tears. I mean, all of her makeup was smeared all over her face, and obviously she'd been crying very hard. And she said, "Oh, I'm so glad you stopped by. I've been praying for God to send someone to help me." And she had just received some very tragic news about something that had happened in her family. I think it might have been a death in the family or something like that, and it had really been devastating to her. And I tell this story because, when I see people arguing that God doesn't exist, that there is no God, I kind of smile inside, because as I did on this little video I did on YouTube, I say God can prove he exists, because I've had hundreds and hundreds of experiences like that, where that little voice has guided me to be at the right place at the right time to help somebody out, or to do something, or answer a problem, or given me information that I had no way of knowing the accuracy of at the time. And then sometimes days later, sometimes months later, sometimes years later, all this data pours in that tells me that this is, a correct principle. I'm just a sec. I'm gonna put the questions window up. And so what got me into emotional healing was, of course, I was an herbalist, and I really very, very sincerely believed that our thoughts and our feelings had a lot to do with our health. In other words, that stress and our mental and emotional attitude, our mood, was a big part of the picture of health. I didn't know a lot about how to work with that. I had been exposed to the idea of positive thinking, and I had experimented with that and had some really good results with it. I'd also found that there were certain things in my life that I found um, it was very difficult for me to change them with positive thinking. And there was one in particular, which was a very deep-seated feeling inside, like no woman could ever really love me. I had been divorced once, and I was married to someone, and we were not very happily married. And the uh, or at least it wasn't a very happy marriage for me. And so this was in 1986. It was the same year I started teaching manager school for Nature Sunshine. It was a very pivotal year for me. A lot of major life events occurred that year. And I was at the Nature Sunshine Convention, which was in Kentucky, and I had some friends who lived in Kentucky, and I went to visit them after the convention. And they told me that they had been doing something very interesting with helping people, and they offered to do this with me. And what happened is, and I don't want to go into the details of how it all got started and everything, but um, I looked at this issue of not feeling loved by my wife, and then that 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 bounced back into problems I had with my mother when I was small. I went back and under their kind of guidance, I remembered a time when my mother had lost her temper, blown her cool, and was chasing my brother and I around our bedroom with a belt, hitting us. When she finally got us to hold still in front of her, she said to stop crying or she was going to hit us again. And not that my mother was normally horribly abusive. That was one of the only times she really got that violent. But I mean, you know, there was a generation where people a lot of times spanked children more, and my mom would sometimes, willow my legs, which was take a little sapling and tingle the back of my legs with it. But I remembered how hurt and scared I was as a little kid with this happening, and my friend told me, said some things, and I had an experience that kind of resolved that situation. And as soon as that situation resolved itself, I bounced back to another experience where my mom had been in the mental hospital for a couple of months while I was in kindergarten, and I was in the upstairs room in the house I grew up in, and some kids had been teasing me outside and started chasing me and pestering me, and I fled inside the house to escape them, and they were still in my front yard taunting me. I was looking out the window and they were taunting me, and the babysitter that was with me, I asked her please to go get them go away so I could play outside, and she didn't want to be bothered. And I felt very abandoned. My mom wasn't there, nobody had helped me. And again, my friends said some things, and that situation started to resolve itself. And as soon as it started to resolve itself, I had probably what was the weirdest experience that I'd had up to that time in my life, because suddenly I had this sensation that I was under this tremendous pressure, like I was being squeezed from every direction. It was completely dark, and they said, "What's happening?" And without even thinking about it, I blurted out, "I'm being born, and I don't like it. This hurts." And then I suddenly had this sensation of coming out into this blinding light, and I was in a lot of pain, and I suddenly I was whisked away, and I was lying on my back in a little box looking up at the ceiling. And they said, "What's happening now?" And I said, "They've taken me away from my mother. I'm hurting and I'm all alone. And nobody's here to help me. Nobody's here to comfort me." And my friend said, "There's always someone there for you." And at that point, I had a very interesting experience, because I saw Jesus lean over my incubator, because that's what I was. I was obviously lying in an incubator. My mother had told me before that I had nearly died in childbirth because the umbilical cord had been wrapped around my neck 3 times. And it was only the fact that our family doctor was one of the best pediatricians in Salt Lake that I had actually survived. But I saw Jesus lean over my incubator. He reached down and he touched his finger to my forehead. And as soon as he did that, the best way I can describe it, I've read about people having near-death experiences and having a life review where they see their whole life come before them and be present, so they basically can see all these events of their life simultaneously. Well, that happened to me, except that it wasn't my whole life. It was one aspect of my life that I saw in blinding clarity over the whole course of my life, and that was that because I had felt abandoned as a baby at birth, I had concluded my mom didn't want me. My mother didn't love me. And my mother's subsequent mental health problems had reinforced that belief. And that belief had become a general belief that, if my mom didn't want me, no other woman could want me either. And what was interesting is I saw how that belief had caused me to be attracted to women who didn't love me. In other words, I was always pursuing women who would reject me, which would reinforce my belief that women didn't love me. And I was currently married to someone who had a lot of emotional wounds and really didn't know how to love, and she was attached to me for the standpoint of what I could do for her, but she didn't really love me. It was because I didn't really believe that any woman could love me, and but I saw that that wasn't true. And the reason why I knew it wasn't true is because I could see all the women who had loved me in my life, starting with my mom. I realized that my mom did love me, and my mom was probably, probably been drugged or whatever. That's the way they did things in the 50s, and she was probably out as badly as I was, and she wouldn't have known, that I was in pain or hurting or so forth to help me. I saw Margot Pia in the 9th grade, who had always was teasing me, and I realized it was because she, had a crush on me and was trying to pursue me and get me to notice her, and I couldn't see it. And I saw a number of instances where young women had, been interested in me, and I couldn't see it. I couldn't acknowledge it. And I understood at that instant something that's in the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul says, we see through a glass darkly. And I realized that this dark glass through which we see is our belief systems, that we see the world as we believe it is, not as it really is. That our belief systems cause us to filter life so that we accept evidence that reinforces our beliefs and we reject evidence that contradicts them. The most painful thing of all that I saw was there was a young woman I had known in college, very beautiful blonde lady majoring in outdoor recreation, who liked my poetry, and I was friendly with, and I had had her go do something with me one time with some a gentleman that and his family that I greatly admired, and this man took me aside and he said, that girl really loves you, and you should ask her to marry you, because she's would be a good partner for you. And I looked at him and I said, no, we're just friends. She doesn't feel that way about me. And I saw that I was wrong. I saw that if I had pursued her, she would have gladly married me. And that was really a shocking revelation to me, that I could be so absolutely blind to seeing what was. And instantly this feeling that, I was not lovable was immediately gone, because I could see the evidence that indicated that there were definitely people women who loved me and liked me and everything, and it was all my perception of life. And it was a very transcendental experience, and it was like everything inside of me shifted in one split second. because I was seeing things that I had never seen before. I was perceiving things that I had never perceived before. And as I was flying back to Utah the next day, I was on the plane. I was, pondering this. Like, God, how is this possible? How is it possible that something that I have struggled with, that I have tried positive affirmations on, and excuse me, couldn't get them to work, and actually did a little bit of counseling on, um, and it prayed about and done all these things, and it had to change. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a little bit of bronchitis. And how is it that is possible, that could change in an instant? And the Spirit said to me, evil works in darkness. And that which is in darkness in us, in other words, that which we are unaware of, unwilling to look at inside of ourselves, works in us for evil. But nothing that is brought into the light can be evil, for all things are made pure in the light. Therefore the righteous seek the light, and in it sorry and in it they are healed. The wicked shun the light because they will not that their works be made known. And I realized in that instant that nothing that I was willing to confront that happened to me in life could ever hurt me. It is only what I tried to run away from, only what I tried to bury, only what I tried to suppress and refuse to acknowledge and deal with could hurt me. And that was an amazing revelation. It's something that I have now spent 30 years of my life putting to the test, of over and over again facing things inside of me, feelings and memories and things that were difficult, and confronting them head on. And I've seen over and over again that it worked. Well, I was really, pleased with what had happened to me and the insights I'd had, but I had no idea that I was going to be working with anybody else. It wasn't until late that fall of that same year, I think that this happened earlier in the year, and later in the year, I went down to a National Health Federation conference in Southern California, and somebody came to the booth where we were at and asked if, said, I understand you know how to pull down a hiatal hernia, and I said, yes, I do. And she said, well, I think I've got one. Can you work on it? So there was a massage table there, and I said, sure. So she hopped on the massage table, and I was working on her hiatal hernia, and as I was working on it, trying to loosen it up, suddenly she looked up at me, and she had like tears welling up in her eyes. She says, what's happening to me? I feel sad. And I said, well, sometimes, because I had learned this from massage therapists and so forth, where you have tension stored in the body, that's because there's some kind of painful memory associated with that tension. And as you're trying to loosen it up, sometimes it brings up the emotions that are associated with that. And she said, well, that's interesting. Tell me more. And I for some reason, I told her what I had been through with my own emotional healing experience with my friends. And she looked at me and she said, you have to do this for me. And I said to her, I don't know how. I didn't understand fully what had happened, that my friends were able to get me to go back and relive that and work through that with me. I had no idea how to even begin. And I said, I don't know how to do this. She said, you don't understand. You have to do this for me. And that little voice of spirit inside said, yes, you do. And I went, okay. And Dallin Wall, who was working with me at Nature Sunshine at the time, actually that might have been 87, the beginning of 87 when I was doing something else. He came and we when we had her come up to the room, I felt like it was best that there were two of us, having a single woman. Um, and I don't remember exactly how I did this. I mean, I had her lie down on the floor. I had Dallin at her feet, and I was up at her head. The way my friends had done this, they were a married couple. He had been at the head and she'd been at the feet. So I said to her, just get going. I said, well, just talk to me about what the problem is. And she started talking about that she'd gone to she'd known that there was something wrong inside of her, but she couldn't remember it. And she had gone to a counselor to try to figure it out, and he had wound up sexually molesting her. And from there, we went back, and she had a memory of being with her father, um, and sitting on his lap and feeling, loved by him. And as she was talking about this, the Spirit said to me, ask her this question. And I said, did your father ever betray you? And at that point, she said, yes. And she arched her back and started rocking from side to side like something was on top of her and she was trying to shove it off, and she was saying, no, no, and crying. And I had this sensation. I was cradling her head in my hands. And I had this sensation like this wave of energy came into my hands and went up my arms and slammed me in the middle of the chest. And suddenly I had the emotional experience, and I literally mean this, I experienced this emotion as if this was happening to me. I felt what it was like to be a 5-year-old child being sexually molested by your father. And it was such a mixture of emotions. There was anger there, like, how can you do this to me? There was betrayal in there. There was hurt and pain in there. There was this whole big jumble of emotions involved in all of that. And I was like, wow, and I just started crying. And I lifted up my head and I looked at Dallin at her feet, and he was crying too. I could tell that he was, hugely emotionally affected. And I thought, okay, God, now what do I do? And but I let her body express the pain and the trauma and whatever. I just felt like she just had to confront this or face it at the time. And so she did. And then finally I said, okay, let's come out of this. And I had an impression of what to do to comfort her, and I told her to imagine that she had like a puppy dog or something like that. I really don't remember the exact thing that happened, and she was able to calm down and feel a little better and came out of it. And after we were done, she said, "Was I sexually molested by my dad?" Excuse me. And I had heard of false memory syndrome, and I said, you're the one who's going to have to figure that out for yourself. But she looked at both of us, and the thing that impressed me is before this was a woman, she was about 26 or 27 years old. She was a businesswoman, and she had this aggressive, hard look about her, sort of like a little bit like a bulldog, very square jaw, very firm, kind of like aggressive personality, and her whole face had changed. All her features had softened. She looked much more feminine, much more relaxed. I mean, I've seen this many, many times in doing this work. Her whole countenance was different, and she looked at us and she said, "You are the first men I have ever trusted in my entire life." And when she left, Dallin said to me, she was sexually molested by her father, and I said, well, I had the same impression too, but I wasn't going to tell her that. But again, it was like, how did that happen? What was just going on there? And especially what I was really puzzled about, being a father myself and really loving my kids, is how can someone do that to their own child? How can someone do something that heart, you know, hurtful to their own child? And again, the Spirit said to me, only a heart that is so closed that it can't sense the pain in another can do this. And only a heart that is so open and so soft that it can share the pain can heal it. And that was my second big lesson as to what emotional healing was all about. It was about being able to open up one's heart so much that one could actually literally share, feel, sense, be open to the pain and suffering of another. Now, I'm not talking about taking it on. We're not talking about being responsible for it. I mean, that's a different issue. People who try to take on other people's pain and become responsible for it are going to get in trouble. This is just being open to being able to be compassionate enough to truly understand and empathize with another human being's pain and suffering. And I'm going to talk more about that particular principle in the next session for this webinar. But that stuck with me. And so it was just a short time later, I was in my living room, and another friend was over, and as she was talking, she said, and again, I don't remember how we got into the subject. She said, well, my unwed teenage mother gave me up for adoption at 6 months. And having had the experience of actually reliving my own birth and being aware that the infant is aware and emotionally aware, I suddenly imagined myself as a 6-month-old baby whose mom was giving me up for adoption and how I would feel. And I looked at her and I said, you must live with a tremendous sense of abandonment. And she says, I feel that way all the time. And again, I got the little impression, do something about it. So I had her lie down and had my wife of the time hold her feet, and I worked her head, and we went back and she relived being a little baby and crying, and nobody was there for her. And I said, there is always someone there. And she said, I see him. And I said, go to him. She says, I can't. I said, then ask him to come to you. And she told me afterwards what she had experienced. She said she was hungry, her diaper was wet, and she was lying in the crib, and she was crying and screaming, and nobody was coming to take care of her. And she saw Jesus again, and he was, but she couldn't go to him because she was just a little baby. But when I said, have him come to you, Jesus came to her and picked her up. And she said to me, that was the first time in my entire life that I have felt loved. And that was a remarkable transformation. She actually became my helper for a while in doing emotional healing work. And she brought to me the third person I did emotional healing work with, who was someone who, when we did this young lady went back and remembered being sexually molested by her father when she was 2 years old. And then she went back and relived being physically abused by her father at 6 months of age. She said she couldn't move her arm and her leg hurt. And again, she had a remarkable healing also with that. She went back and told her sister about what she had experienced, and her sister said, oh, you didn't know? when you were 6 months old, you were crying, and Dad got so mad he picked you up and threw you against the wall and broke your arm. And she hadn't known that had happened to her, but she actually relived having it happen to her. Well, after we helped her resolve this, and she felt loved, again, this sensation of love that she'd never felt. And I told her, I said, up until this time in your life, you have had um, a subconscious sensation of a father who is abusive and who doesn't love you. And so I said, that would make you attracted to men who would mistreat you. But now you have a new idea of a father, a loving heavenly father, who really cares for you and loves you, and you will now be able to attract into your life a man who will truly love you and care for you. And she looked at me and said, so what do I do for my 2-year-old daughter, because her dad, my ex-boyfriend, has sexually molested her? And I tell you, something hit me. I mean, it hit me, again, like square in the middle of the chest. And I heard this little voice, and it said, the sins of the fathers are visited on the heads of the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. And I understood something. I understood that when you are abused growing up, you tend to either become an abuser or become someone who enables abusers, so that this cycle perpetuates from generation to generation until someone can heal it. And over the next 24 hours, I broke down 3 times and just sobbed, because it was like I was feeling the weight of this pain in the world. I had never realized, because even though I had a mom who was a little bit mentally disturbed and a couple times would go off the rocker and be a little bit physically abusive, I had never had the kind of abuse that I was encountering in doing these sessions with other people. And I thought of all the suffering in the world, and I thought about how the suffering perpetuates itself. And I just pled with God. I said, please, God, show me how to help this. Show me how to help people end it, how to help people heal, so it doesn't go on to the next generation, so the cycle stops and it gets fixed and healed. And I literally just pled for that knowledge. So it was over the next 2 years that a flood of information was given to me. All of the basic tools that I now teach for emotional healing were actually given to me in that 2-year period. It's only been my experience in learning how to use them and understand even deeper what's going on, because it was difficult to explain. I mean, I didn't have the words or the language or whatever to explain what was happening. I could do it, but it was so hard to explain, because I myself didn't completely comprehend what was happening or why this was working this way. But I learned about the question affirmation technique from a chiropractor on the south coast of Australia. I learned about flower essences from Matthew Wood's book, 7 Herbs, Plants as Teachers, which became a good tool. I started learning how to use aromatherapy, essential oils, to do this. I learned about a technique called mental tools. I learned about symbolic journeys. I learned about, I just literally a whole host of arsenal of tools and understanding was flooded to me, and I realized, looking back, it was an answer to my prayer. It was an answer to me, desperately wanting to make a difference in the world, and that's what has propelled me in this work ever since. And as I went forward with it, like I said, I used to tell quite a bit of these stories. I was trying to hold some classes, and then I ran into these problems, and the Spirit said to me, this is not the time for this work. This is not the time for it to go forward. People aren't ready for it yet. So I've continued to do emotional healing work for in spite of the fact that I wasn't like trying to do too much to actively teach it until just a few years ago when I wrote my first book on the subject and I started putting together some coursework. But I still just felt like there was something blocking me. And then it was actually on November 9th of this month, I woke up and that little voice said, now is the time for this to go forward. Now is the time. And so anyway, I this is why I'm doing this. I really am looking for the people who are really interested in this, who are inspired by this idea, because I have worked with things that you wouldn't imagine. In the third session, I'm going to talk a little bit about working with people who have been ritualistically abused, which is the worst. God started me off easily. He started me off on incest, rape, child abuse, by parents, the easy stuff, and then ended me with ritualistic abuse. And also, basically, I've worked with people who the trauma of losing loved ones. I've done emotional healing with two people who had their spouse, the person they love, murdered in front of them. I talked to people who've been through war and seen atrocities in war and everything, and I've become totally fearless. I'm not afraid of anybody's story, experiences, emotions, feelings, whatever. Doesn't bother me. I've faced it all with people, and I can say that over and over again I have seen the two basic truths that I was taught right from the beginning work. That is, number one, I've been guided by the principle of helping people go inside and face what's inside of them. And I'm not just talking about the memories. It's not the memories that are so important to face as it is the feelings, the emotional feelings that remain unresolved because the person is afraid to feel them. And it's amazing how afraid most people are of their own emotions. It's like they can't really even allow themselves to feel something. And I think what's really interesting is I realized no matter how painful something may feel, feeling the feeling will never kill you. And when you actually confront it and are willing to feel it, it's the oddest thing in the world. It becomes an energy or an experience that just passes through you and is gone. It becomes like the monster in the child's nightmare. As long as you're running away from it, it haunts you and grows bigger and gets scarier and so forth. But as soon as you are able to turn around and confront it, it starts to dissipate. And I remember one time this lady with extreme anxiety, a friend of mine asked me to work with her, and the first thing I said is, feel your anxiety. Don't try to make it go away. Don't judge it. Just feel it. Let yourself feel as anxious as you can possibly feel. And I finally coaxed her into just experiencing her anxiety, and she experienced it for a couple of minutes, and then she said to me, wait a minute, it went away. She said, you knew that was going to happen, didn't you? And I said, yes, because that's what happens when you stop running away from it and you are able to confront it and move through it, and you bring it in, especially you bring it into the light, which means you are able to acknowledge it and look for divine assistance. It actually turns into something good for you. It actually changes you. The fact that you face those things makes you more compassionate with other people. It makes you less judgmental of other people. It makes you better able to help other people. It's an amazing transformation. And the second part of that is about the compassionate heart. All of the one of my my friend who I did the second emotional healing session with, who had the experience of having this vision of Jesus picking her up as a baby. One time we were doing a class and we were talking some things and somebody was mentioning a particular, you know, construct of how you do something about this. She said, Stephen has no technique. And she said to me once, everything we are doing is a front for what we're really doing. All the techniques are tools that help. They help you get it, get into the thing of what's happening with people, but the real healing takes place from the compassion, from the ability to have a compassionate sharing of the person's experience, where you're not putting a block between you and the other person, where you're having a sensation of being in this together. It's like the pain that is shared is lightened. And what happens in our society and what's happened in our culture is we get locked into our own little pain and suffering. We feel isolated. We feel alone. And the burden of our pain and our suffering and our anger and our fear and everything becomes overwhelming because we feel so alone. But once we start being able to open our hearts and give permission for our feelings to exist, then that shared understanding lightens the burden for everyone. And in the classes that I teach, you see this happening over and over again. That you start off, and people are afraid to show their feelings. Like someone may, be talking about something, and they start to get teary-eyed, and they get a little tear coming, and they go, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Like them being sad is this horrible, awful, burdensome thing to everybody. And when you reassure them, "Hey, it's okay. It's okay to cry. It's okay to be sad," and you genuinely mean it, and you're totally comfortable with it. It doesn't bother you, which it doesn't bother me at all. Then the person opens up, and as people open up, it's amazing, because what happens is this bond of love forms in these classes when this happens. It's just this huge bond of love. People don't feel isolated and alone anymore. They don't feel cut off. They feel like, hey, I'm known, I'm cared for, I'm loved. It's the most incredible thing that you can imagine. But like I said, you can't help someone process a feeling that you can't deal with inside of yourself, because if they're, getting in touch with some anger and you're really uncomfortable with anger, then you're going to do everything you can subconsciously to make them not express that anger, because you don't know how to deal with it. But when you know how to deal with anger inside of yourself, it doesn't bother you when someone else is angry. When you know how to deal with grief inside of yourself, it doesn't bother someone else that is grieving. When you know how to deal with fear inside of yourself, it doesn't bother you that somebody else is afraid. The reason why you're bothered by other people's emotions is because you're bothered by your own. When you get over being bothered by your own, you're not bothered by anybody else's. And you're free to be understanding, compassionate, because you realize that their feelings are about them and your feelings are about you. And the things that I've learned in all of this are just absolutely amazing. So what I want to do with these webinars, and I'm really sorry for the technical difficulties we had getting started tonight. I had just used my webcam like a week ago, and I had no idea that my webcam was going to fail on me while I was trying to set up this webinar, and it kind of put me a little bit discombobulated in getting started. But once we got started, I think it all turned out okay. But what happened when I went into this world of emotional healing, and I've described it like this: I went into a world that I didn't even know existed, and found out how absolutely essential it was and how real it was and how much it impacted this world. Because I found out that the heart, our feelings, are the doorway to our spirit, the doorway to our spiritual understanding, and the doorway to our social connection of love to one another and to the planet. And the more that we're in denial about our feelings, and the more shut down we are in our heart, the more we've hardened our heart, trying to bury and suppress and hide from our own feelings, the more cut off we are from each other, the more cut off we are from nature, and the more cut off we are from God. And so when I do the second session next week, I'm going to talk about the spiritual lessons I learned and some of the amazing experiences I had of how this has taught me about the nature of divine love and the nature of many spiritual things. Because what happened for me is spirituality was no longer ideas. It was no longer words in a book. It was no longer things that someone had taught me. It was a living reality existing in people's lives that could be accessed and with incredible transformational power to change people's lives. This is a powerful work. I have seen amazing changes take place in people in doing this work. It is the most fulfilling, rewarding, most satisfying thing I have ever done in my whole life. And I'm very anxious to train basically what I'm calling an army of healers. And I'm going to explain in the third session why I'm anxious to do this and what I feel the calling here is. Because I want to put an end to abuse. That's my goal. I don't think traditional counseling is that effective. Not that counseling isn't good, but the reason why it's not effective is because it's mostly centered up here in people's heads. And this work goes straight to the heart. And it's in the heart that people experience the most dramatic transformation. And I've had people tell me that they've gotten farther with me in an hour than they did in a year of counseling. In fact, we did our first Healing Hearts workshop here in St. George a couple of months ago, and a lady said, I've gotten more benefit from this workshop than I did in 2 years of counseling, 2 years of therapy. And we actually saw in the workshop a dramatic transformation in her and her attitude with this work. I believe that what I've been taught, and it's things that, like I said, that I've been, I didn't invent this. It was taught to me. I didn't learn it from books. I didn't go out and go to college to become a psychologist or anything like that, even though I've read books about that stuff. It was taught to me by Spirit, and it's powerful. And the time has come for this to go out there because I think it could revolutionize psychiatry and counseling and so forth because it's that powerful. And it isn't a technique. It's a state of being that enables you to do that. The techniques are great. When I see things like, okay, there's a lot of techniques out there for emotional healing. There's emotional freedom technique. There's can't remember, there's this emotion code thing that somebody's doing, I think, that actually lives here in St. George. Carol Truman wrote a book called Feelings Buried Alive Never Die. All of them give a technique for doing with this. I don't have a set technique. I'll use any technique. It doesn't matter because it's not the technique where the healing takes place. The healing takes place in the connection, in the emotional connection between me and God and me and the person in front of me. And it's not preaching. That's the other thing. It's not me trying to convert them to anything or teach them anything or get them to do anything. It's them discovering that within themselves. In fact, that was one of the big things I was taught, is to not try to fix it. I never try to fix the person's problems. My effort is to actually let them discover the source that I discovered that will help them fix their problems without me. And that's a really big difference than most things. So I'm going to wrap this up for tonight because I didn't want to go much over an hour. We had a little bit of a rough start, I know. But like I said, next week I'm going to talk about the spiritual principles that are behind this, the things that I learned, and why I believe this works and why it's so powerful and why it's in alignment with really absolutely correct spiritual principles. And the third session, I want to talk about my vision of some of the experiences and things that why it's so essential that this work goes forth. So this was recorded. It will be posted on a page on Modern Medicine. I'll send everybody who was here a link, as well as I will be putting it up as a YouTube video because I want these 3 videos to be an introduction to this work. I may have to edit this one just a little bit before I put it up because of kind of the rough start to it. But it will be up and you'll be able to review it. And I will also be in the third session, and probably in putting it up on the website this week, rolling out our plan of how we're going to get started with the training program, what we're doing with the training program, with our Healing Hearts workshops, with our coaching program and everything else to start moving this program forward. But so I hope you've been inspired by tonight, and if this doesn't resonate with you, then like I said, don't worry about it. I mean, I'm looking for the people who they feel the connection of what I'm saying, and they feel within them that same burning desire that I felt, that they want to help. Because that burning desire, you don't need me. If you have that burning desire, you'll discover things just like I did. But the big thing is to get the burning desire to want to help. So thanks again for watching tonight. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then I'm going to answer questions. So